even when we were only like 15 people, and as silly as it might have been, it was just important to start trying to articulate the things that we think make us a unique and high functioning company. We have these standards that we actually use to also define our kind of engineering levels internally.
Okay.
So they're like very real kind of values and standards that like we talk about. And so the four at the highest level are trust, support, constructive disagreement, and design for change. And so trust, I think people think that one sounds really boring. I actually think it's really interesting because a lot of our documentation around trust is not about the fact that we trust each other so much as it is about like building things that are easy to trust, right? Like write code that is easy to trust and not cryptic. So it's not just about the kind of feel good side of trust, but there's a very practical consequence when you're building systems with trust. And then, right, it's if you work in a place that kind of by default is trusting, it's also up to everyone to actively maintain that trust by being trustworthy and like kind of providing guidelines for what that is. So that's kind of what that standard's all about. Support, we kind of talked about. A big theme of this is just rubber ducking. Don't do things alone. Always have a thought partner whenever you're working. We have a really big community. We have a big customer success team. We all support the community. The engineers support the CS team, et cetera. So just making sure that that is front and center. So, and then I want to skip to design for change next. I think that one is just too important to not write down. But once again, this one probably sounds like an engineering framework, which it is. Like make sure that you write code that is adaptable, can be extended by others, that kind of feeds into good testing philosophy, et cetera. But there's also a process side of this. So at the company level, we have a value of avoid inertial thinking. So a decision that might be the right decision today is not going to be the right decision a year from now, especially at a startup, because we're going to be potentially twice as big next year. And like, who knows what new functions will be around and all of that. And so experimenting with processes and always designing processes to be temporary is a really important thing for us. And so things change a lot internally. And instead of like hiding that, we just embrace it. We're like, all right, so we're going to run for this particular feature. We're going to do stand-ups and this thing. For this other feature, we're not going to do that. We're going to do this other, thing where we're going to write an email once a week or something. And like, it's all customized to the project. And whenever, we start to see a theme emerge that like across all projects running it this way was useful, okay, that actually can become a new process or guideline that we implement. Oh yeah, you're going to ask something, Tim?
Oh yeah, I was just going to say, I love that because sometimes there's a negative stigmatism towards like change. And it's always like, oh, I thought we were doing this way. Like, I don't want to get uncomfortable now and have to flip it up. And so I like how you explain, like, make change easy. It doesn't have to be this hard thing. In fact, it can be a very creative thing for us if we design for it and embrace it. So I thought that was creative.
I think it's an empowering thing too, because if you're an engineer that maybe doesn't feel that you have ownership over the processes and the changes, then sometimes change is annoying because you're just like, well, no one consulted me. But the way we do it is we just we have very open retros, and whenever we do an experiment, we just get everyone to talk about it. And so that feedback directly feeds into the next iteration because we're never beholden to doing it the way we had just done it. We're always like, and so once you can establish that feedback cycle, that if you participate in one of our internal process experiments and don't like it for some reason, like you feel that your feedback actually gets heard, which is important, and then makes it really easy to be like, sure, I'm game to change things up all the time because I know that we're going in the right direction. And then, so the last standard, this is the one that I'm personally like the most, just always going to say, like, learning new things is always an intrinsically motivating activity, I think. So it's constructive disagreement. So this idea that, we have a positive internal culture, et cetera, but that doesn't mean we don't disagree and like really get in the weeds with, contentious debates about like the name of something or how something should be architected. And at its core, like we believe very strongly that learning something new is an active activity. So it's phrased in our document as knowledge must be forged. You don't just get to hear a fact and then all of a sudden you have that as knowledge. You have to like work with it and like push its limits, etc. And a lot of the time, the way that forging happens is through constructive disagreement. So two people who don't see things eye to eye, talking it through, finding, in like a clear, articulate, academic way, basically, like find what assumption are you disagreeing on? And maybe you're not going to agree on it, but identifying it as an assumption that's like, okay, here's where we're different. So important, can kind of open your eyes to new ways of thinking about things. Then it can make it really easy to just be like, oh, okay, well, but we can both agree that assumption then isn't maybe high priority or something. Like, okay, now we're seeing eye to eye again. And then one other thing, when you're changing things a lot and you do have a disagreement, making sure the disagreement always ends constructively is important, because when you go revisit a decision, if somehow it became like a very emotional thing or emotionally charged discussion, revisiting, as we all know, can be challenging, because you're like, all right, we got to bring up this whole thing again, and making sure that there's always some kind of constructive conclusion allows decisions to be revisited easily.
It's like the age old saying, never go to bed angry with your wife, right? Like you don't ever want to, end the day on a sour note. You don't want to end a meeting, where you walked away and it was like, nah, I didn't really feel like Chris was right, and I don't like that. And like,
right.
like you don't want to have to come back to that next meeting and there was like something that was unfinished. So I think it's a really fascinating thing to have these standards. Was that something that, it was, how were these standards come together? Was it something that you and your co-founder kind of like decided like, we're going to have these standards, or was it something where you brought the team in and you were like, hey, let's all kind of come together and assemble these as a team? I'm just generally curious.
Yeah. So for the standards at the company level, definitely it was a kind of small, I believe at the time when we first started this process, it was me, Jeremiah, and our COO, who you mentioned, Sarah Moses. And we just thought,